All right, we are jumping right into a huge story today. The entire history of the United States. We're going to take a super fast journey through revolution, conflict, and some incredible growth to figure out how a superpower was really born. Okay, let's get into it.
So, this is the big question we're trying to answer. How on earth did a handful of colonies, a nation literally born from protest, end up becoming one of the most powerful countries in the world? Well, it's a complicated story, full of ideals, conflict, and constant change.
First things first, to really get the story, we've got to rewind way back, before 1776. You see, the history of North America didn't kick off when European ships arrived. It started thousands of years earlier with the people who already called this continent home.
So picture this. Long before Columbus, the Americas were absolutely teeming with complex societies. You had cultures like the Mississippians building massive cities and huge trade networks. You had the Iroquois Confederacy, which had this incredibly sophisticated democratic government. Heck, there were even some early European visitors like the Norse who popped over in the 11th century. But 1492, the year Columbus arrived, that was the game changer. It kicked off a collision of two worlds that would change everything, forever.
And this is where you can see the core of the conflict. You're looking at two completely different ways of seeing the world. For many native societies, land wasn't something you owned. It was a shared resource connected to everything. The Europeans? They showed up with a whole different playbook. Private property, digging up resources for profit, and a mission to spread their religion. It was like trying to fit two puzzle pieces together that were never, ever meant to connect.
So let's fast forward a bit. All this leads to the establishment of colonies, including the 13 English ones along the East Coast. And it's here that a totally new, unique identity starts to form, one that would eventually put these colonists on a direct collision course with the biggest empire on the planet.
So what was the spark that lit the fuse? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was like a staircase of events, each step getting more and more intense. Britain was broke after a major war and decided to tax the colonies to pay for it. The colonists fired back with the classic line, "No taxation without representation." Protests led to violence, like the Boston Massacre, and then the Boston Tea Party was really the point of no return. Britain cracked down hard, and by 1775, the first shots were fired. The revolution had begun.
Just stop and think about this sentence for a second. In the 18th century, the idea that all men are created equal was absolutely radical. It was the fuel for the revolution. But beautiful words don't win wars. The real turning point came when the Americans won a major battle at Saratoga. That victory was huge because it convinced France and then Spain to jump in and help the colonists. That support was the game changer they needed to take on the British Empire.
And here it is, the grand finale of that fight. The Treaty of Paris makes it official. The United States is its own country. But, winning the war is one thing. Building a nation from scratch, that's a whole other challenge. That's where the Constitution comes in, creating the blueprint for a government that's still around today.
But independence was just the start. The 19th century is this incredible story of a nation being pulled in two completely opposite directions at once. On one hand, you have this unstoppable drive to expand westward. And on the other, a deep, brutal division over slavery that was tearing the country apart from the inside.
And this was the idea that fueled that westward push, manifest destiny. It was this powerful, almost religious belief that America was meant to stretch from coast to coast, that it was its destiny. This idea was used to justify everything from the massive Louisiana Purchase to the war with Mexico that added a huge chunk of the West.
But there's a really dark side to manifest destiny. This expansion came at an absolutely devastating human cost. Policies like the Indian Removal Act weren't just about moving people. It was a violent, forced eviction of tens of thousands of Native Americans from lands their ancestors had lived on for centuries. The brutal journey west became known as the Trail of Tears, a nightmare where thousands died from hunger, disease, and cold.
As the country grew, this massive crack running right down the middle just got wider and wider. You basically had two different countries living under one flag. The North was industrializing, while the South's entire economy was built on the backs of enslaved people. Every time a new state was added, the fight was, would it be free or slave? When Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in 1860, promising to stop slavery's spread, the South saw it as a threat to their very existence. The nation just broke.
What followed was the Civil War, the deadliest conflict in American history. It was brutal.
Turning points like Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and the huge Union victory at Gettysburg began to turn the tide. In the end, the North won, the country was saved, and the 13th Amendment finally, officially abolished slavery. But the cost was immense, and the nation's trauma was made even deeper when President Lincoln was assassinated just days after the war ended.
So, literally rising from the ashes of the Civil War, America enters this period of just explosive, chaotic change. This Gilded Age, with its massive industries and waves of immigration, completely transformed the country. It went from a wounded nation trying to heal to an industrial powerhouse, setting the stage for its big debut as a global superpower.
To get a sense of America's ambition, let's look at a few key numbers. First up, $15 million. What's that? It was the bargain basement price for the Louisiana Territory back in 1803. With one check, the U.S. doubled in size. This showed just how big the country was thinking, long before anyone called it a superpower.
Okay, jump forward more than 100 years. A new number, over 100,000. That's how many American soldiers died in World War I. For a country that had mostly tried to stay out of Europe's problems, this was a massive shock to the system. It was a brutal, costly entry onto the world stage, and after this, there was really no going back to isolation. And after the next World War? Billions. This is about the Marshall Plan, this unbelievable American investment to rebuild a completely shattered Europe. It wasn't just charity, though. It was a genius strategic move. It stabilized the continent, created new allies and trading partners, and built a wall against the Soviet Union's influence. This is what cemented America's new role as a global economic superpower.
So, if you look at the first half of the 20th century, it was just one massive global conflict after another. The U.S. tried to stay out of World War I, but got pulled in. Then, bam, the attack on Pearl Harbor throws it headfirst into World War II. That war ends with the U.S. using the atomic bomb, which immediately ushers in a totally new kind of conflict, the Cold War, this decades-long, high-stakes standoff with the Soviet Union. So, after all that, America is one of the world's two superpowers. But the story shifts again. This time it turns back inward, focusing on these really tough, long-overdue fights for justice at home, while also having to face brand new threats from the outside.
I mean, think about it. The country was founded on the idea that all men are created equal. But for millions of African Americans, that was just not the reality. The civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s was this incredible, powerful push to make the nation finally practice what it preached. The words of leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. became this rallying cry for America to close that huge gap between its ideals and its reality.
And then, this date, September 11th, 2001. There's really a before and an after this day. The attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon were a shock that didn't just change the skyline. They fundamentally changed the country, and really the world, kicking off a new era of conflict and reshaping security for decades.
So after all that, where does it leave the United States today? Well, the past is never really past, is it? It's still a dominant world power, no question. Militarily, economically, it's still a leader in science and tech. But it's also a nation that's constantly wrestling with its own story, trying to reconcile all the complicated and often contradictory pieces of its own history. And that's our whirlwind tour. What's clear is that the history of the United States isn't some dusty old story on a shelf. It's a living, breathing, and often painful story of constant reinvention. The history is still being written, right now. So the only real question left is, what's the next chapter going to be?